What are some advantages at a high level of nuclear fusion as a source of energy?
Fundamentally, as a source of energy, in fusion, you're taking these lightweight isotopes, you're bringing them together, you're releasing energy, and that energy is in the form of charged particles. It's already in the form of electricity. Fusion itself has electricity built into it without a lot of the steam or thermal system requirements. And so that's a really nice fundamental benefit of fusion itself. Also, this reaction that's really hard to do turns itself off. So you end up with the fusion is fundamentally safe. And that's really a key requirement of any industrial system is that it turns itself off and is safe. You turn the key off on your car, you know it's going to turn off.
I guess the flip side of that, just sort of stating the obvious, but it's nice to lay it out. For nuclear fission, it's chain reaction, so it's hard to shut off. And it works by boiling water into steam, which spins turbines and produces electricity. Can you talk through this process in a nuclear fission reactor?
In a nuclear fission reactor, you put enough of this fissile material, uranium or plutonium, together such that as these unstable molecules, these unstable atoms crack open and break apart, they release heat. That the component parts of those are actually quite hot. And so not only are the component parts that the uranium breaks into, and it's a whole spectrum of different atoms and atomic nuclei, are hot, but it also releases neutrons. It also releases more of these uncharged particles. And if you do it right, this fissile material will be next to other fissile material. And so that neutron will then go and bombard another uranium nucleus, again, opening that up and releasing more heat and more of these neutrons. And that's how you have those reactions of a self-supporting chain reaction. And that chain reaction then continues. People design fission reactors such that you have just the right balance of enough neutrons are made such that the reaction is continuing, but not so many neutrons are made that it speeds up because you don't want it to speed up.
And there's some kind of cooling mechanisms also, like that's part of the art and the engineering of it.
And then the key is at the same time, you want to make sure that the whole thing is in water, is typically the cooling fluid. There's some more advanced fission reactors that have different cooling fluids, but water typically, where then that absorbs that both the heat and those extra neutrons. And so you use the water and the fluid to then run a steam turbine to do traditional electricity generation and output electricity through your steam turbine. You end up with complicated systems of flowing liquids and flowing water, balancing the heat. A lot of fission reactor design comes from that thermal balance of keeping this reaction going, making sure it doesn't speed up, because that's an uncontrolled chain reaction, which you would not want, and balancing the cooling and the output of getting the water out of it.
So we should say that for reasons you already laid out, maybe you can speak to a bit more, is nuclear fusion is much safer. So there's no chain reaction going on. You can just shut it off. But it should also be said that as far as I understand, the current fission nuclear reactors are also very safe. I think there's a perception that nuclear fission reactors are unsafe. They're dangerous. And if you just look empirically at the statistics, that the fear is not justified by the actual safety data. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, we've been talking about the reaction processes themselves, but I think fundamentally, let's take a step back and look a little broader and say, let's look at what we care about, which is the power plant making electricity. And I look at this from a nuclear engineer's point of view. I spent a lot of years studying these systems. And modern fission reactors, I believe, are engineered to be safe. They're engineered in ways where as those reactions maybe speed up, and those systems get hotter, they actually are built to expand and cool down passively and natively. And there's protection systems in place that modern systems are quite safe from an engineering perspective. And so I believe that we have figured out how to build nuclear fission reactors in a way where the engineering of the power plant is safe. I would say that I look back at the history of what we've built over time, and the challenge hasn't come to the engineering, actually. I believe the engineers have solved these problems. The problem comes from humans, and the problem comes from other things around nuclear power. You have to enrich that uranium to put it in a plant, and the plant's safe. but you had to enrich that uranium, and that is some of the problem. Or a plant is designed to run for a certain number of decades safely, but do we run it longer than that? And so those are where I think the real challenges happen, is more with the humans around these systems than the engineering of the power plants themselves.
Well, I have to ask then, what do you think happened in Chernobyl? What lessons do we learn from Chernobyl nuclear disaster and maybe also 3 Mile Island and Fukushima accidents? I think you're suggesting that it has to do with the humans a bit.
So with Chernobyl and Fukushima, I actually put 3 Mile Island in a different category. In fact, some of the recent news in the last year is that we're going to be restarting 3 Mile Island because there's such a need for clean baseload power. So that's actually a very interesting other topic we should talk about, is why and how we're doing that. But more than that, going back to the accidents that did happen, in both of those systems, you can point to the human failure rather than the engineering failures of those systems. That in Fukushima specifically, there were multiple nuclear fission reactors on the same site that successfully kept running through the tsunami, totally successfully, and were only later shut down for more political reasons. But the old one, the oldest of them that had been on site for long periods, and maybe too long, I think some experts have looked at this in the past, was where the some of the problems actually happened. And so I look to that less as a failure of the engineering of the power plants and more of the humans and around those systems, that we should be operating these plants as designed, and then I believe they're safe. And that gets to some of the atomic weapons questions that I think are the other part around nuclear reactors and fission reactors that are concerning for me.
Can you speak to those? So maybe this is a good place to also lay out the difference between nuclear fission power plants and nuclear fission weapons, and maybe also nuclear fusion power plants and nuclear fusion weapons. Like, what are the differences here?
Fusion power plants can't be used to make nuclear weapons. Like, fundamentally, that the processes in fusion aren't the same processes that happen in nuclear bombs and nuclear weapons. And so it's actually one reason I started in fusion. And most of our team thinks about the mission of fusion, of delivering clean, safe electricity, is that it also can't be used to make weapons. And I think that's a little bit of a distinction from traditional nuclear fission reactors, is that while I totally believe as a nuclear engineer, we build power plants now that are safe, that aren't going to have reactions. They use a fuel, uranium and plutonium, that can be used to be made to make nuclear weapons. That we know that if you take enough fissile material together, enough uranium and plutonium, put it in a small volume, that it will not just create a reaction, but it will create a supercritical reaction that will then continue and grow and release a tremendous amount of energy all at once. And that is a bomb. That is a bad situation. And that is what we want to avoid. A lot of the key is recognizing that even though there are things called fusion bombs, the H bomb, the hydrogen bomb has uranium in it. It's still a fission bomb. And so how this fundamentally works is that you have a fission reaction, a primary, and that creates radiation that induces a fusion reaction with a small amount of fusion fuel that then boosts that uranium reaction again. And so most of the energy, in fact, 90% of the energy in an H bomb, is all still from the uranium reactions themselves.
Yeah, I think people call it sort of the nuclear fusion bomb, hydrogen bomb, but really it's still a nuclear fission bomb. It's just that fusion is a part of the process to make it more powerful, but you still need, like you said, the uranium fuel. So it's not accurate to sort of think of it as a fusion bomb, really.
And if you take away that fissile material, that nuclear fission reaction, the fusion reaction doesn't happen at all. In fact, there's been researchers that have, over the decades, tried to make an all-fusion bomb and been very unsuccessful at it. The physics and the engineering don't support it can ever happen with our understanding today. The topic we're talking about is more broadly called proliferation. And this is the creation of nuclear weapons in the world and the distribution of those weapons. And something we know as physicists and engineers is that fusion can't be used to make nuclear weapons. We know that. But that is not sort of widely known. And part of what we went out to do is work with the proliferation experts in the world, the people who work to prevent nuclear weapons from being made, being created, being shared throughout the world, because we know the challenges, that the geopolitical challenges that happen. And we went to those proliferation experts, and we were worried they would have the sort of the same historical question of like, well, the word nuclear is in fusion, so therefore it must be related. And in fact, the total opposite happened. What they told us is, please go develop fusion power plants absolutely as fast as possible. The world needs this. And the proliferation experts were telling us that otherwise people would start enriching uranium throughout the world. And we'd be building enriched uranium power plants because we need the electricity that's clean and baseload. But in those processes, they'll be making fuel that could be one day used for atomic weapons, for nuclear weapons. And they were worried that the growth of this enriched uranium, think about the centrifuges, that having a lot more centrifuges happening all over the world would lead to more weapons, at least the possibility of it. And so they are pushing us as fast as possible. Go build fusion generators and get them deployed everywhere, not just in the United States, but all over the world, so that we're building fusion power. And that's meeting humanity's needs, not this other thing. And so I was really pleasantly surprised. We've written a number of papers and worked with those communities on this of what does it mean? How is fusion power safe and can't be used for nuclear weapons?
So this might be interesting to ask on the geopolitics side of things. I have the chance to interview a few world leaders coming up. By way of advice, what questions should I ask world leaders to figure out the geopolitics of nuclear proliferation, nuclear weapons, nuclear fission power plants, and nuclear fusion power plants? What's the interesting, intricate complexity there that you could maybe speak to?
The question I would want to ask is, what would you do if we could deliver for you low cost, clean, industrial scale, tens or hundreds of megawatts of fusion power that's low cost, clean, baseload, and doesn't have the geopolitical consequences of uranium and plutonium, of fissile material? What would you do there? How would that change your view of the next 30 years?
But also, there's a lot of geopolitics connected to oil, natural gas, and other sources of energy, which I think are important in Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East, in Russia. I mean, all across the world. And that's interesting, too. So do you think actually if everybody has nuclear fusion power plants, that alleviates some of the geopolitical tension that have to do with energy, other energy sources?
I certainly do. That the fuel is in seawater all over Earth. Everybody has deuterium. And everybody has it. And so you can't have a monopoly on the fuel.
Yeah.
And no one can control the fuel, and no one can turn off the fuel. No one can cut a pipeline. Like, that just cannot happen with fusion. And so if we can deploy those plants and we can deploy them quickly, then it decouples the ability of any one or any few countries to control energy.